Thank you, Chair. And I thank my colleague, Mr. Cooper, for his excellent analysis and putting into context the seriousness and the importance of this motion, and quite clearly why it should be studied not only in other committees but particularly here in ethics. This government I have known all along, as do Canadians, literally for the last 8 years. This is the most ethically challenged, corrupt government this country has ever seen. And I think what it does, this public inquiry and the evidence that we have heard through this public inquiry and the reports from a number of media giants, really underscores and makes it abundantly clear to me as an opposition parliamentarian, but I'm sure to my entire colleagues on the bench, as well as across Canada, the rationale as to why the Prime Minister, his government, and his backbench fought so hard to avoid this public scrutiny. We always knew that there was a fire to this raging smoke, this smoke screen, and it brings it really home to me personally, given all the work I've done on a number of committees, but particularly in relation to the foreign interference angle, as to why he handpicked the Special Rapporteur David Johnston, who had access to the same information that the Justice is now receiving, but clearly had a different focus as he was receiving the information, and a different focus in terms of his report, that in his view, irregularities wasn't sufficient enough to raise the red flags. No mention at all about the leaks. He had access to that information. Canadians were denied the right to know that information. So it brings it all home to me as to why they did everything that they could to avoid public scrutiny. I've had the ability to really assess the cross-examination of our Prime Minister yesterday and contrast that and compare that to his cross-examination, if you call it, when he testified at the Emergencies Act inquiry by Justice Rouleau. It was not a good day for the Prime Minister. No. There were so many significant differences in the evidence that he gave as contrasted to his Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, when she testified over a year ago.
Yeah, she lied.
Well, some could say she lied, and that's certainly an approach you can take. But the most glaring example was that she was adamant a year ago that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reads ferocious amounts of material, voluminous amounts of material. Everything that is put in front of him, he reads, and he follows up, and he takes his job as Prime Minister serious. He takes the job of Canada's national security serious. What an absolute joke that is when you hear from the Prime Minister himself yesterday that he's too busy. He's too busy to read confidential briefs from CSIS that highlight incidents that could compromise our national security, that could compromise the fairness of elections, that can compromise the integrity of nominations. He's too busy to read that himself. He wants his yes men and his yes women to do a summary for him. That is a very damning, conflicting piece of evidence, Mr. Chair. And now to hear that there was a top Liberal staffer who reported directly to the Prime Minister, who leaked classified sensitive information, compromising, as Mr. Cooper has indicated, compromised the CSIS investigation. There is clearly an offense for that type of activity. Section 4 of the Security of Information Act spells it out in plain language that a person who holds that confidential information and shares it with another individual, in this case, the member for Don Valley North, has committed an offense under that act. Section 27 outlines the punishment for that act. What my colleague Mr. Cooper talked about was the indictable phase of the prosecution of that offense. It's actually a hybrid offense. You can proceed by indictment or summary conviction, but given that the limitation period for prosecuting by summary conviction has long passed, it has to be indictable. This person has a high probability not only of being convicted, but a high probability of spending the next decade in federal prison. That's how serious this matter is. I thought, in the last 6 months to 12 months, Mr. Chair, involving in all the scandals and all the rotten corruption from this Liberal government, at one point I was sitting on 4 or 5 committees at the same time, just keeping track of all the scandals. And I just remarked to myself, just imagine all of the referrals that the RCMP are now getting, just from the actions of this Prime Minister and his government and the federal public service. I just spoke to my friend, Mr. Cooper, and I said I often wake up at night just thinking about all of the scandals, all of the potential investigations. We finally had an opportunity not too long ago, Mr. Chair, to question the commissioner of the RCMP regarding the SNC Lavalin scandal. And the only thing that I could conclude from that, notwithstanding their strong proclamations that nobody is above the law, including the Prime Minister, the evidence was there. The evidence was very, very clear based on the information that they had available to him by the Ethics Commissioner that Justin Trudeau did commit the offense of obstruction of justice by attempting to interfere in the decision-making of his then Attorney General. So the only thing that I could conclude, as well as many Canadians reviewing that exchange, is that there was indeed a two-tier level of justice. Now, I'm hoping that the RCMP are watching this, that they're following along with the inquiry, that they're reading the press, and that they are gaining some suspicion. To launch any police investigation, Mr. Chair, there has to be some suspicion. To lay a criminal charge under the Security of Information Act is a low threshold. Do the RCMP have reasonable and probable grounds, a very low standard to proof beyond a reasonable doubt for conviction purposes? Do they have reasonable grounds to believe that a top Liberal insider, political staffer who reports directly to Justin Trudeau leaked highly sensitive, classified information from CSIS? I think based on the evidence that we have heard in this inquiry, that threshold has easily been met. So I would hope that given their reservations, that no Prime Minister in the history of this country has ever been charged with a criminal offense, that they would cast aside their reservations and their political reluctance to look at the Prime Minister as a suspect worthy of criminal prosecution and actually go after this sole person who is responsible for this leak. My colleague, Mr. Cooper, stood up yesterday in the House during QP and quite pointedly asked the question that Canadians deserve to know, that all parliamentarians deserve to know. Who was that person? The Parl secretary stood up and completely ignored that question and talked about, as many Liberal members have talked about, that we respect the inquiry, that we welcome the inquiry. Again, completely not being truthful and honest with Canadians. They knew there was something to hide. They knew there was a smoking gun, and here it is. This is worthy of a full-blown investigation, Mr. Chair, and that is why I very proudly support this motion. But before I give up the floor, I am asking for a brief amendment to the motion. There is a reference to a Matthew LaFrance in the motion. Where his name is referenced, the amendment should read, quote, senior Liberal staffer who received CSIS briefing, comma, Matthew LaFrance, end of parentheses.